Okay, so what I want to do now is explain how to build a Sinatra application um, and kind of go over how I think about planning it and organizing my code. Um, and the application we're going to build is something I've been wanting to do for a while, which is there are a lot of ways to share music online. One of my favorites is SoundCloud, but as a DJ, every now and then you'll remix a song that includes a song that you don't have the rights to, such as Another One Bites the Dust by Queen. And because of that, SoundCloud will take down your song. So if you want to share remixes that you've made that include songs that you don't have the rights to, SoundCloud doesn't work. So what I've been basically doing is building these really simple HTML pages where I upload the song that I made to S3, and it could be Dropbox or, any kind of server. And you can see it's a really simple, basically, site that creates this single player, which is kind of cool. And while you're not going to be able to hear the song play, you can kind of hear the song there, and there's a link to download it. So it's a nice way to kind of share my own remixes. Now the problem is that manually kind of building all this code is a little bit annoying, and I thought it'd be fun to basically build a Sinatra application that allows you to register and basically put in a bunch of URLs for songs that you want to share, whether it's just one or many, and it'll basically generate a site like this for you and then deploy it. So it's going to be a bunch of different technologies, and I'm not quite sure exactly how it's all going to work out, but that's sort of the goal, is to allow people to generate these kinds of websites. The requirements are not going to be super obvious, because one thing that I don't want our Sinatra application to do is host the sites themselves. I want to use what basically I've been using to deploy these sites, which is a really cool front-end free web host called Surge, which is kind of like similar to like GitHub Pages or Netafly, but I find it really simple, so that we're going to basically generate this HTML and then deploy it to Surge and give the person that URL. So again, it's going to be a little bit of a tricky sort of end part, but I think we have a lot of time until we get there. So knowing that's what we want to build, let's get started. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm building a Sinatra application, especially if I'm planning on using active record, sessions, kind of things that Sinatra doesn't necessarily come wired up with out of the box, is use this Corneille gem, which was actually built by a Flatiron student. And we can kind of look at it really quickly on GitHub. There's Brian. He's a former Flatiron student, and he built a Ruby gem that generates a Sinatra app with sort of like a Rails-like MVC structure, which is, again, what we kind of want to use. Corneille, by the way, is an anagram for LearnCo, which I thought was really cool. So I just installed that gem, and then I'm just going to use it to basically generate a new application, and we'll just call it, Mixshare. And there we go. I forgot how to use this gem, Corneille. So let's try that again really quick. Oh, new, of course. Corneille, new, Mixshare. In fact, actually, let me see what other options there are, here in terms of what we have. So yeah, it's going to use our spec grade. Okay, cool. So Corneille, new, Mixshare. And that will give us basically the structure of our site. Let's open it up in Sublime. And then let's start with just making this a Git repository. I'm just going to get a Git ignore in here. Put in DS store. Start there. And let me also make my to-do file. There's my first to do, and actually with that, at this point, I just want to make my first commit to just kind of stub that out and get started. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is sort of go over the application structure and see what's working and see what's not. Given that this is that Sinatra and Rails are all rack-based applications, whenever I start this server, the first file that's going to get run is going to be config.ru, which is going to then load up this environment file, which seems to set some variables, requires bundler, joins bundler, creates an active record connection to a SQLite database. That's going to be in our DB directory. It loads our application controller, which basically sets some defaults. It also weirdly requires the environment, which I don't think it should need to. So I'm actually going to delete that line for now and just try to keep this cleaner. We have models, we have views, we have a layout, a welcome page, initializers, there's nothing in there. We have a spec directory. Okay, so that is basically everything. Then we have our gem file. And one thing I want to try to do here is actually, I'm going to unlock this active record version of 4.2. That way we can use the more modern version of active record. And then I'm also going to unlock the SQL version over there. So basically just remove all versioning from this gem file. And here we have Shotgun, which is our development server. We also seem to have Thin for some reason. I'm actually going to drop Thin also out of there. Shotgun is actually our reloader. It's not our server. I have no idea what server it's going to use by default right now, but I'm excited to find out. Bcrypt for eventually passwords. Tux, which will be our console. Cool. So that works for me for now. And then I also just want to check out my rake file really quick. Okay, gets the environment and then loads my rake tasks from the active record Sinatra gem. Okay, so I have a sense of what's going on and what's where. I have no idea if any of this works. The first thing I'm going to do is just run bundle. Just made the font a little bigger. So it's going to install all these gems, which will probably take a second, and then we'll go from there. All right, so we have this weird error about your bundle requires gems that depend on each other, creating an infinite loop. Please remove either database cleaner or database cleaner active record and try again. So I guess I'm just going to remove database cleaner for now and see what happens. I don't know what's requiring database cleaner active record, but we'll find out actually after we do the bundle successfully. And I'm actually going to make a note of these things because I want to make maybe some improvements to Corneal. So one, we removed environment requirement from application controller. Two, remove database cleaner. And then three, we unlocked all gem versions. We also removed Thin. So those were all the changes we made, and maybe after this project is done, I'll actually make a pull request to the Corneal gem and see if I can fix that. So everything installed. Again, clearly Corneal hasn't been maintained super actively in a while, so it doesn't surprise me that we had to make a whole bunch of changes, and I basically now need to just make sure everything still works. So I'm going to try to start up Shotgun and see if my server works. So it's loading WebBrick, which is the default Ruby server, which is fine for now. And then I am going to go back to the browser, and let's see if I can load the site. Okay, so we got a boot error, and it says something went wrong in config.ru. It says no method error, undefined method needs migration for active record migrator class. So that is probably an artifact from you can see there's the code over there from an old version of Active Record, where before we start an application, we basically want to check to see if any migrations need to be run. And in Active Record 6, clearly this method has been moved, so I am going to actually just quickly Google Rails 6 and see kind of how Rails 6 does that, because it definitely changed. So here's where we can see that it's clearly in Rails 4.7. I generally am not a huge fan of API doc, but it does give me like versions, I guess. So I'm gonna start here, but there's also actually the Stack Overflow. And then there's also, I can see over here, the migrator. So there's kind of a choice if I need to kind of make. Let me start with Stack Overflow and see what they give me, right? Man, this really does look like this was a Flatiron student. So let's see. Change your code to Active Record base connection migration context needs migration. Okay, let's try that. Before I try that, actually, though, I want to make sure that that's part of Rails 6. Support Rails 0.5 migration checks. Okay, I'm actually just going to do one more thing. Rails 6 check pending migrations. I just want to use like the best syntax possible. You know, it just makes sense to kind of like, I like to learn. This is kind of an opportunity to see how the differences between the versions of Active Record and Rails 6 and things like that have changed over time. So I'm just going to take this opportunity to kind of scroll around and see, you know, if anyone kind of mentions anything. This resource of Rails seems limited, so we have around 6 stable branch. Yeah, so this doesn't actually give me much. Let's see over here. Pending migrations, rake db abort. Okay, this is super old. So, yeah, let me just try, I guess, this kind of, and make sure that, so here I see this in, so this is pretty recent, February 6th. And I don't know why Google gave me this file, but let's just see what's going on in here and see if I can find anything. Irreversible, duplicate, unknown migration. Oh man, this stuff's Google. GitHub is so awesome. All right, so here's a pending migration error, which is defining the error, but it's not actually giving me how we know run pending migrations, whatever. It's not. We actually don't know how it knows that yet. So I am curious as to see what raises this pending migration error, because whatever raises that pending migration error is probably going to be the method I want to use to tell the user, hey, you have pending migrations. But while I'm still in this file, let me just kind of read some more. Okay, so now we have a whole bunch of comments, which is basically the RDocs. And here's the migration, and then check pending. Okay, so there's a check pending class, right? And there's definitely a method over there. So here we have raises active if error migrations are pending. So this looks basically like what I was looking for, and I think that's exactly the this says needs migration, but this says is checks pending, and that's a Bang method. We probably want the question mark method is probably a little better. But again, I'm just going to keep on like reading, because as I kind of scroll through this, I'm actually learning some other stuff. And again, I always love learning, so we're just going to keep on reading a little bit. reverting, migrate, direction, say, announce. So there's needs migration. Okay, so that's basically the method we're going to use. It looks legit. Right, perfect. Okay, great. So let's just use that. It is definitely a little bit of a more verbose, line than active record than the previous version of it, but that works for me. So let's just update this code instead of migrator. So it says active record base dot connection dot migration context needs migration. Is that really? I mean, I'm not super personally, I think that that's not the most obvious way to communicate to a programmer to check migrations. But let's just see if that works. And then I'm going to spend a second looking for a more elegant solution if there is one. But I do also just want to get past this and get the app booted up. Perfect. So we know that that works, which is great. And we see the Cornel, app, and we got a GET request, and I'm happy with everything. But I'm just going to take a second and see if I can find, if that is really the best way to check for a migration. All right, so after Googling around for a little bit, I really couldn't find a more elegant line of code anywhere for this functionality. I'm not exactly sure why they changed it, but I guess it probably makes sense. I mean, it must. One other thing too is that it would be Rails. No, it's still going to be Rake. Huh, this will be interesting. Okay. So that's fixed, and I'm just going to make another note about the improvements. Check pending migrations. Okay, cool. So the website is running, and we can kind of move on and now actually start planning our application. So great. Let's get started with that. Okay, so we're going to need a user class, right, with like authentication, email, password, right, unique emails, whatever. I'm really just putting them in because I know those are the requirements, right? And then I think the two main classes we're going to have, let me think about the database structure for a second. So I'm thinking that we have like playlist, right? And a playlist like has many songs, right? So that basically the playlist is going to be the thing we generate, and it could have many songs. Now, if I look at these kind of like, so let's say playlists, and then you have an ID one, and then so you have a name, right? You have a user ID, who it belongs to, and then I'm just trying to think, like, do we really need? So far we have like the user has many playlists, but what is the song model really giving us here? Right, if I have many playlists, great, so I know I can generate them. And then when I make a playlist, I'm basically putting in, right, what does really a song have, right? A song, it has basically a playlist ID and a URL. Yeah, that sounds about right. Okay, I like that database structure for now. Okay, so that works. And as I always say, like when I'm planning an application, I always kind of think of the two bookends of the application. One of them is the database and the models, which is all the way kind of on the back end. And you can kind of see I've accounted for that. Like I can imagine, for instance, me having a playlist that would look something like, in terms of the database, the row, it would kind of have something like this in it. Where it would be like bite the dust, right? User ID 1. and then playlist ID 1, and the URL would be, bite the dust, I don't know, .mp3, something like that, right? And if I wanted to add more songs to that, that would work also. Okay, so that makes sense. And then the other side of the application, kind of the other bookend I like to plan out, is the URLs, right? Because that's really the interface that the user is going to use to interact with our application. So, I can imagine playlists new, which is basically creating a new playlist. I can imagine playlists 1, which is the show action, and that would basically be a preview of the playlist we plan on deploying. We want only the user to be able to see this, so it's not shareable via our application, right? I can imagine playlists 1 songs, which is kind of like the songs resource there, so that you'd be able to like add songs, edit songs, kind of from like that URL pattern, and things like that. That's kind of like, then obviously like there's going to be like a register, a login, a logout, and then also I guess there would be like a playlist index page which shows you your playlists, right? That's the base functionality, I think. Eventually we're also going to probably want like some sort of like playlists deploy action, which generates and deploys the static site to Surge, which we have no idea how that will work, but it's also, we don't really need this functionality in theory, because this creates the data that we need in order to be able to do this. And in theory, if we didn't make the show page, or if we generated like a show share page, something like that, you'd still be able to get to the main functionality of the application. So looking at this, and I'm not making too many assumptions about do I need more or do I need less. This definitely kind of gives me the rough edges of what I want to do, and now I basically just have to break this up into sprints. So I tend to tell people to never start with the user model with authentication stuff, because that's like the least interesting part of any application. Like, oh, you can log in and you can register. I'd much rather start with the playlists and the songs, but given that this isn't a Rails app and that's Sinatra and we're going to have to kind of roll a bunch of things ourselves, I actually like the idea of starting with the user model and kind of in sprint 1 basically doing the following. And I'm just going to keep on adding notes. So my first sprint is going to be the user functionality, which is going to be covered by register, login, logout, and the user model, right? Which is sort of like this behavior. So that's my first sprint, and at that point, that's all I need to think about, because I am going to start doing that. Also, by the way, the last thing I want to think about, again, just as a bonus, is it would be nice to have a nice UI theme. Right, okay, cool. So that's where I'm going to start with, and sprint 1 is going to get started. Let me open up a new terminal. And at this point, I actually want to just make a commit real quick to getting started, or preparing for sprint 1. Great. And now I'm going to check out a new branch. It's going to be sprint 1, and it's going to be called user functionality. That's a kind of long branch name, but whatever. It'll be easy, to follow the code along later on if I just kind of use this schema kind of thing. Okay, so we're going to start making the user model. And as we saw in our rake file, we do have access to this Sinatra Active Record rake task from the Sinatra Active Record gem that I think should be able to generate at least our migrations, if not our models, So let's just look at our rake tasks real quick using the rake dash capital T, and that'll tell us what tasks we have. So here we have rake db create, migrate, and oh yeah, here we go, create migration. That's what I was looking for. How did I not see that? Okay, great. So let's just do rake db create migration, and let's make it, we're looking for parameters name. Let's say create users, and let's see what happens. Oh, and we have to say name equals create users, and it's telling us to do it in underscore. Great, create users. I don't think the capitalization here matters, but we're going to find out in a second. Apparently it does. Look how much we're learning. All right, so that generated a migration file. Let's open that up and let's look at what it looks like. Great, create users, active record migration 6.0. That's awesome. So we know that we're using hopefully active record 6 here. Let's say create table, users, do T, and we're going to say t.string email, t.string password. I believe it's digest because we're eventually going to use, and I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but I know that we're going to use has secure password on active record, and I think that's the column. And I think that's, I mean, I'm good with really just that for now, like an email and a password digest. Let's keep the user table simple. We can always add migrations and kind of go with it over time, but for now, that seems to work. So let me end that create table, and let's try to actually now run the migration and see what happens. Okay, so in theory, it ran the migration. And I guess now we're going to make a user model. So I'm just going to create user.rb in here. And I'm going to say class, class user inherits from active record base end. Okay, so now what I really want to do is see if this user model works, to see if it's wired up to the database. Normally I would write tests for that, or actually in advance I would have written some tests, but I don't want to do that. Testing is going to slow us down. I can always do a sprint at the end and write test coverage for the app if we want to. What I'm going to try to do, though, is to use the Tux gem, which is supposed to be a console for Sinatra applications. So let's see if that works real quick. And it's saying Tux, and we said migrations are pending, run rake db migrate to resolve the issue. So I'm trying to understand kind of where this error got generated from, because we did run rake db migrate. Now, we didn't specify an environment there, but as far as I know, we shouldn't need to. Let's just try it, though. Let's just see if we run rake db migrate Sinatra env equals development, if that changes anything. I guess it is weird because I really did intend to see, I really thought we would actually see some migration stuff running, so it doesn't seem to really be working at this point. What I'm going to do is open up my database, my development database, and I have a nice little GUI called base, and right here, this database is basically, as far as I can tell, totally empty. There's just nothing in it. So maybe I can do rake db create first. And it says development database is not configured for the default env, available destinations. Okay, so this again seems to be a little bit about changes in active record 6 and probably the Sinatra active record gem and things like that. And I'm going to go into my config, and let's see. So it's saying that the development database is not configured for the default env environment, and that's telling me that active record adapter not specified. So this is definitely okay. So let's go back to this rake. Let's kind of trace by over here what's going on. So over here we send Sinatra env equals developments. Let's also try something else really quick. Let's go to the environment file, and what I'm basically going to do is also create a Rails env and just basically make that equal to whatever the Sinatra env was. What I'm basically thinking here is that maybe maybe Active Record or the migrator or whatever is looking for like Rails env. So I'm going to start there and see what happens. I know that I need to get one of these tasks to run before anything is really going to work. So we're going to probably be doing a little bit of some weird debugging over here. So we still got nothing. So at this point, I guess what I'm thinking is that what I want to look into right now is what changed about established connection, and what also might have changed about Sinatra Active Record rake. And basically this gem that we're using over here that is supposed to be, that's basically providing us with these rake tasks. Let's go look at it at GitHub and see if anything about that gem has changed. So with that, let's do Sinatra Active Record and see what is what. Okay, so here's the gem. And this is a fork of it. This one is way more recent, which is good news. Extend Sinatra with extensions for rake tasks, Active Record ORM. Cool. Now in your Sinatra application, set database connection. So require, okay, so we do that. So set database. So this is interesting because note that in a modern application, you will need to first register the extension. So we definitely, I don't know. I mean, I know I didn't do this. So this is interesting. Okay, so we're going to think about this line of code and figure out if that's ever needed. But for sure, this is interesting in that now require the rake task in your app, in your rake file. Great. So let's just kind of reading a little bit more to make sure. Okay, so let's try to actually sort of grab this namespace task and update our rake file with that and see if that helps the gem find what we're looking for. So here it says load config and it's requiring the app. What I really want it to require though is the environment. So let's see if that makes a difference to anything. That didn't. That didn't. Okay, so we're still getting Active Record adapter not specified. The development database is not configured for the development environment. Okay, so I'm more confident that it has to do with this thing. So, and my guess, okay, yeah, so let's look at the API for this. I'm getting a sense of, I think, what it might be, which is, and I'm going to take a really quick guess. I bet you that this now takes a hash of environments. So like development, for instance, and then this takes the key over here. And the reason why, and by the way, I'm totally guessing. So, the faster thing to do would have just gone straight to the API, but I'm just going to, make it an assumption. And the reason why I think that is because it says adapter not specified. The development database is not configured for the development environment. And the available database configurations are, and it's giving me nothing. So either we need to rewire a lot of things, which is probably true. I have less confidence this is going to work, but let's just see what happens. Okay, cool. So we got a new error, but it's not helpful. And it says active record adapter not specified. Database configuration is not specifying adapter. And there is the adapter. Okay, so at this point, we need to back up and just start looking at like, active record established connection Rails 6 or active record. Yeah, let's just look at that for now. Again, I want to avoid API doc. I like to use the native ones. So this is Ruby on Rails 6, which is good name, which is that's definitely modern. And let's see what's going on here. So connected to connects to a database or role, except reading or writing another custom role for the duration of the block. If role is passed, we'll look at the connection. So here we kind of have, this is for supporting multiple databases. And that's not what we want to do, but that's interesting. Returns true, the role is connected, yep, so this multiple database. So connection returns the connection currently associated with a class. This can only be used to borrow the connection to do database circulating specifically, right? So connect returns the configuration of associated connection, right? So this is interesting. We probably are curious about this in terms of a debugging, and I kind of want to just go to my code real quick and just kind of leave myself a hint of some interesting things, right? If we need to debug further. And then it says connection pool, and then it says connects a model to specified database. This has a lot to do with like the application record kind of abstract classes. I don't think we're gonna have to get into this here yet, but I'm still looking for, like established connection, right? Okay, great. So establishes the connection to the database, accepts a hash as input where adapter key must be specified. So it's looking for, so this is pretty interesting because this is what we had, established connection, adapter, right? In case active record-based configuration isn't set, a symbol can also be given as an argument representing a key in the configuration hash. So this is interesting. I don't know what that method is, but let's open that up. Here what we're getting, the exceptions, adapter not specified, adapter not found, and argument in return is an error. Right, so there's where we got adapter not specified. So something is borked there. And it looks like we're also getting adapter not specified there too, where it says the development database is not configured for the development environment. And that's before we kind of put in that subhash, which looking at this looks to be definitely not the right way to do it. Okay, so let's go back to our code and see if we can debug this. There's established connection. We know that, this was more accurate than not. So there is where I'm establishing the adapter, and I know that my gem file requires SQLite. So what is going on? Okay, so let's go back into our environment file here. And I guess what I want to do over here is actually just jump into a pry session for a second. And that should basically load when I'm doing rakedb create before it tries to do anything else. And I kind of want to see, I had that line of code over there that I think I could use to debug this a little bit, which is the connection configuration. Let's see what this is, what this returns. So there's where it returns basically that hash we passed in. And if I go back to the documentation, there were some, interesting things here. So current role connects to connection pool. Right, so here's connection. Let's see if connection returns to me anything. Interesting. So there we do have a connection. So if I like, for instance, I think that if I remember correctly, I could like say run select star from users. This should give me a SQL error. Oh, okay, cool. It's execute. That should give me a SQL error, at least telling me that like, you know, it doesn't know what that table is, right? Great. So the good news is that we're definitely connected to the database, right? So the issue really here is that whatever's trying to run rakedb migrate can't find this connection. Because, you know, here I'm definitely seeing that, like if I say connected, we're getting true, right? So there is a connection to the database. So the question really is why does the rake task not think we're established? Why does the rake db migrate not think we're established? We've established a connection. So I guess, you know, here I'm now curious about, like, what if I throw pry in here and not in here? I'm just more curious about like kind of what's going on as I debug this. Right, so now again, like what I'm looking at is like, is this connected? So false. Okay, so that's interesting, right? Which is to say that when I ran rake db migrate, let's go through kind of what happened. The rake file took over, and we required our environment here, then we required active record rake, and I just kind of want to just like introspect on some things. What does it think our Sinatra environment is, development? What does it think our Rails environment is right now? Not that we have a Rails environment, I'm just kind of like going through some debugging, right? So all that stuff got set correctly, but what we do know is that loading the environment didn't establish our connection correctly. At least, yeah, I mean, that's what we know. So, and I guess I am also just curious about what the connection configuration is. Cool, so it does know about it. It just didn't establish the connection correctly. I don't know why. So there are a few things I want to try. I want to go back to the Sinatra documentation over here for a second. Because here it said like set database, and I think this is what's wrong. Which is that it's not enough for us to, my guess is that it's not enough for us to establish the connection in this file. I think we also need to run something like that. And I don't even know if that's going to work, but here's what I'm going to do for now. I'm just going to create so there's my hash of the database development configuration. And now I just want to pass this to both this and to that. Okay, so I'm trying to establish the connection, and then I'm also trying to like sort of like set the Sinatra variable over there to that. And now I'm going to go back to my rake file. I'm actually going to comment this out and only let my task load config run the environment. No, you know what? I can't see a reason why doing both should make a really big difference. But let's see what happens now. Okay, so first, this is great because we got a deprecation warning we didn't get before. So I'm just curious to this. So it says deprecation warning: setting active record base configurations with an array equals deprecated. Use active record base configurations equal directly to set the configuration instead, called from environment 14. Okay, so let's go up here on environment 14 and just kind of clean this up. So this is, okay, so I don't know what's going on here. So that's deprecated. And it's called from line 14, but line 14 is really being called from this gem over here, right? And I'm just curious. I kind of want to go through some of the coding here, I guess, and just see where it's triggering this deprecation. And then also, just really quickly, maintainer wanted, allows agreement without environment name, prefer app environment to rack environment, okay, whatever. Those are some interesting ones. Let me just see the issues too. Right, so here's the issue that we're dealing with. Right, so okay, so I mean, one, by the way, I'm pretty interested in maintaining this gem. I mean, we use it a lot at Flatiron School. So I'm also just gonna make a note of that, like, you know, it might be interesting to also okay, so now let me see if I can just quickly, without actually fixing the gem itself, you know, see where that set method is defined or what, and then maybe update it or just overwrite it myself with that configuration. So it's definitely not the rake spec, which is good news. So in here, cool. Connection, move connection, expect to establish the connection, not to reserve, so app database. So app is going to be the whole, right, so right. So at some point, there's going to be a line of code where it's looking at the configurations. I haven't seen one yet. Right now, it seems to be mostly dealing with the connection. Yeah, I don't see anything in here that should be testing that. So we're going to have to go look at the probably the source code. So here's the source code. No, well, these are examples, so forget that. Here is lib Sinatra. Create a connection. So what we're really looking for here is a line, is basically a call to this. So it's definitely not in this file, or at least not yet. Ooh, this is interesting, right? Because that's with is use active record base, right? So this is interesting because when you say def database equals, what you're basically calling is this, and here's where the code is basically broken. In that it's going to be this line of code that's triggering it, right? Where it's saying environment to S, and the reason why is because the spec, when it is a hash, and spec symbolize keys, right? So okay, there we go. So it's actually not necessarily a bug. It's really about just misusing the instructions. And can you comment on a line of code? No. But I do want to point it out to myself so I remember it, so I can fix this later, which is set database needs to be structured with environments so that this does not trigger. Okay, so that's the issue there. And I should be able to get around this by basically saying set database, and actually here, it's basically, this is my database config, and here's where I want to actually nest it and say development. And now what's going to happen is that because this is a hash, right? And when I symbolize the keys, it has environment to sim. So actually what I'm looking for is an environment key, maybe? Where's this word environment? Where's that coming from? Oh, I see. Okay. App settings.environment. Right. So what I failed to do actually is correctly set the Sinatra environments. Right. So it's kind of like, okay, so let me go to the Sinatra documentation. Setting the Sinatra environment. Right. So set food, right, perfect, right, okay. Okay, so set here we go. So this is what I want to basically do, is I want to say set environment to, and what we're going to do there is say this to sim, right? And then actually, okay, I want to copy this, but I want to go back to not having the nested hash there, to really just keep it as a single hash, but to set the environment over there, and then let's dump this in here. And then we have set database, and then let's make this to that. And now, because the environment has a development sim, which should basically trigger this, because the spec, well, it's saying spec symbolize keys, and then environment to sim. So I don't think this is going to be it yet. Let's right, so there I'm still getting that deprecation warning. And again, at this point, like, I'm really just trying to get rid of that. I'm trying to understand it. So let's see. So environment is, so if I say environment, what does that give me? Nothing. And when I say database equals, which is going to be what my set method is, so I say set database, and then that's what spec is. So spec symbolized keys would be this. And does that key have, okay, so let's actually go back to a nested one. Okay, so there's that. I'm actually going to comment that line of code out for a second. Going to be really just like super. I'm just going to try something. Let me go back to the README on here for a second. Okay, so I'm just gonna, even though I'm not gonna need to use that yet, but okay, so let's see, okay, so now, let's just see again. Okay, no problem, let's just, Awesome. Okay, great. No deprecation warning. So that is the better way to do it, right? And there's still a lot of things, like I'm making a lot of assumptions about development in here, and I'm actually just going to make a note to myself about this, which is sort of like clean up. Okay, cool. So after all that, we should be good. I'm also going to go to my application controller and just try to register that extension. Now let's try rake db migrate. Awesome, there it created the table. Let me get rid of that binding.pry. Cool. And then I'm not sure I need this. And I guess the only way to know that is to do it again. Yeah, I mean, I figured I didn't need this load config over here because I'm doing it around everything. And the reason why I'm doing it around everything is mostly because you know, if I want to write a rake task that isn't about the database, by having it just loaded in the rake file in general, I don't have to worry about whether it's loaded for just the database tasks or any other rake namespace I need. So I'm just going to leave that out. And you know, if that fails me on my next, actually, yeah, I guess I'll comment it out for now, the whole thing. If that fails me on my next migration, we'll know kind of what's up, right? Okay, so now we've done that, and now back, I want to try tux, right? No deprecation warnings, perfect. Oh, warning, constant, fixed num is deprecated. All right, but that's not, I'm not even dealing with that. Forget that. Now what I want to basically say is user.all, right? Perfect. We were able to queue up the user model. If I say user.create, it will make a user, beautiful. Now user.all returns it, awesome. So the database, the model, all of that is all set up correctly, and I know that's wired up correctly, and I can move on to starting the controller functionality. But that was a lot, so I'm going to make a commit and just say that basically fixed application, environment, and database to respect. Yeah, basically, and database. There we go, right? And then also, well, I should have actually, let me actually take it back one. Because yeah, you know, whatever. I already added all of them. It's really 2 commits here in theory. It would be 1 commit about fixing all the environment stuff, and then 1 commit about adding the user model. But, you know, I'm just going to say database for user model. There we go. Cool. Awesome. So that's my commit. And now we're going to move on to starting the controllers and building a registration page for the user. All right. So now that most of the sort of like environment stuff has been ironed out, hopefully, we can move on to actually trying to build out a registration page. So let's just go back. You know, we made a lot of changes, so I'm going to restart the server, make sure that we're still running correctly, and then my goal is to basically start figuring out a way to, you know, build our registration page, right? Cool. Awesome. So that loaded correctly, so that's good. And now we're going to create our first controller. So I'm going to go to controllers. I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to call it the users controller.rb and follow this kind of like MVC paradigm that Rails has and that you will learn so much more about soon. I'm going to define my class users controller, and I'm going to have it inherit from application controller. which I hope, these kind of settings over here of like the public views and things like that, I'm hoping that they inherit correctly. And I'm going to build a new route called get/register. And, I'm just going to actually just test it really quick with like hello. And then also I'm going to remember to mount this controller in config.ru, so that every time we build a controller, we mount it over there. And given that we're not going to have a lot of controllers, or we shouldn't at least, I'm not going to really worry about like automating this. I don't mind kind of manually mounting it. Now that we've mounted it, I guess I'm curious to see what happens when we go to get/register. Do I need to restart the application or anything? Cool. Awesome. The controller worked. Super happy about that. And now we can start building out an actual registration view. So I'm going to say ERB, and it's going to render a view in users new.html.erb. Normally we would have like the view follow the convention of the action name, but I like the URL register, and I like my views to then still represent sort of the MVC paradigm. So let's go into views. I'm going to make a new directory called users. I'm going to make a new view file called new.html.erb. And I'm just going to put a form in here, action, users method equals post form. I'm just going to put an input right now. And then a submit button. So that should be my form. And then I'm also just going to stub out really quick the route that's going to handle getting that. And I'm just going to basically raise params.inspect. I just basically want to see if the form is submitting correctly. And whenever I'm building a form, especially like given all the environment stuff we've had to deal with in Sinatra already, what I really want to make sure of is kind of the game of catch. I want to make sure that when I hit submit over here, that it hits the correct route over there, and that we see the parameters from the form that was submitted. So let's go back to the browser. Let's reload the register page. Great. And we have an issue, and it says no such file or directory app views users new html.erb.erb. Okay, cool. No big deal. Basically, I was way too specific over here, I guess. I don't need to mention that it's an ERB file if I mention ERB over there, I guess. Great. So there is my registration form, and it's cool. It's like, we clearly have like some sort of layout being supplied by Cornel, which is kind of nice. And I'm going to type in an email address, click register. And now again, we're looking for that game of catch, which is there we go. So that's exactly what I wanted. The correct controller responded. The user's controller in the post action, and we can see that the params have been passed correctly. So that's great. We are ready now to actually build out this form fully and create a user. So to do that, let's think about what we need to do. So the first thing is I want to kind of just deal with the password right away. So I'm going to go to model, and I'm going to say that this has secure password, which I think is all I need to do in terms of active record. I'm going to go back to my form. I am just going to kind of make this just a little nicer and just say like label for email. I'm going to put this in its own paragraph so that we get some nice line breaks. And then I'm going to get one for password. And then now in my controller, what I basically want to do is say like @user equals user.new, @user.email equals params email, and grab those from the form. And then @user.password equals params password. And then I want to say if @user.save, which is going to trigger correctly if it's validations. I want to redirect, for now I'm just going to redirect it to the home page. And I can't remember if Sinatra is redirect or redirect to, but we'll find out really quickly. Else, I actually want to render the exact same view as I rendered before, so I could show error messages once we start putting in validations, which will be pretty shortly. So given that behavior, let's reload the registration form. Cool, we have a little bit of a nicer form over here, although the labels did not work, which is kind of annoying. Maybe I need to put an ID. I shouldn't really have done that because I don't really care about these labels right now because we're going to rip out this front end and make it nice and something. So let's see what happens. I'm also at the point where you can kind of clearly see WebBrick, the default Ruby web browser, web server, is a little slow. So I think we might probably move to Puma once I finish this sprint at least. Let's get an avi at funbound.com. My password is test. I hit register. Cool. Not now. Awesome. Perfect. So that registered my user. We can kind of go through the log and see what happened. A whole bunch of whatever SQL stuff happened. And then here's where it said user create. Here's the email. Here's my password digest where it has my salted password. And we're all set. So it seems as though we were able to register a user correctly, which is great news. And, I guess with that, I probably want to make a commit and just say git right, perfect. Awesome. So that's my commit. And now we have one piece of working functionality. Rather than deal with validations, I actually wanted to go into logging in a user and logging out a user before I actually deal with that. So that is what we're going to do next. Okay, so it's time to build our login functionality. And in order to do that, we're going to need to enable sessions in our Sinatra application. So I'm just going to copy that code and go back to my code base and put into application controller. I think I can just drop it there. Maybe I'll put in configure, but I think this will work in enable sessions. I'm going to make a note. I think I can move this configuration potentially into my environment. So I'm just going to make a note that I might want to experiment with that. Okay. Now that I've enabled sessions, I want to actually make a new controller. I guess I could really put it in the user's controller. It's only two actions. It's log in and log out. Normally I would put it into a sessions controller, but given that I have to mount every controller and Sinatra and stuff and generate it myself, I'm just going to put it into the user's controller. So get login. That's going to be the login form, and then post, I'll post it to the same URL, why not, right? What's the difference? And in fact, I already did that, but, it'd be nice to mirror that paradigm over there. And then I'm going to say ERB, and we're going to render the following view. So login, and then post will just redirect to the home page again also. So I basically kind of really quickly stubbed out at least the rendering of the login functionality. And now I'm going to go and build this form. So let's jump into my users directory, make a new file called login.html.erb. I'm actually just going to steal the form from here. because it's very similar. Have it point to login, change the value of the submit button, and that should basically be the login form. So let's go ahead and make sure that that renders and that we haven't broken anything. If I go to /login, great. And I think I registered with avi@flumbaum.com and test. And now, so in order to build a login functionality, what we basically want to do is try to first find the user by their email address. So that'll be params email. And then we call authenticate, and we pass in params password. This is the method that's provided by has secure password from Active Record. So assuming that we authenticated correctly, we'll redirect them to the home page. Otherwise, and also, by the way, it really should be something like, just in case we can't actually find the user object, we'll just do this kind of Boolean conditional. Else we'll, yeah, I mean, I guess we want to just, yeah, I guess we could just, let's just render the login form again. No big deal for now. So this actually doesn't log them in. This confirms that they entered in the correct information for their login, but in order to log them in, we have to basically put something in their cookie or put something in their session to remember that they're logged in. I'm not actually going to deal with that right now because I just want to make sure that the form and that logic works, and then we'll basically deal with that next step. So let's hit login. Okay, so because we basically got redirected to the home page and did not see the login form, we know that this code of logging them in, of at least of authenticating them, did work. And now we actually have to deal with how do we remember they're logged in, which, again, as I said, is going to be all about managing their session information. And if we go back to the Sinatra documentation, you know, it's really similar to what you're going to learn about in Rails. You basically have a sessions object, which behaves a lot like a hash, and you can store information in there. The cookie that the browser gives to the user when they visit your web page stores a reference to the session ID managed by your server, so that the user doesn't actually know what's in their session. All they know about is their session ID. And then we can use the cookie to match the session to find out if we've put anything in their session that we should remember for their next page view. So assuming they've logged in correctly, what I kind of want to do is just basically put in their user ID into that session object. And then I can always check to see session user ID to make sure that they are actually logged in. So what I'm basically going to do is, on our home page for now, I'm actually just going to dump out, you know, somewhere in here, like session user ID, so that we can see if the session was maintained and worked. And let's see what happens if I go back to the login page and redo that flow. We should see that user ID number 2 or number 1, whatever my user ID is maintained into that session. And then we'll clean it up and figure out how to deal with like locking pages down and authenticating and things like that. So I actually don't see anything in here, and I imagine that's actually more about the HTML of this page than anything else. I'm actually just going to look at the source code and see if it dumped the number anywhere in here. So it did not, it looks like, right? Like I'm just not seeing anything, you know, there is no, that didn't dump out. So, you know, either, I guess there's a few things that could have happened. And I'm really not sure. So let's start debugging this. My first bet is that maybe we need to just restart the server and actually to enable sessions. And because anyway, we were talking about WebBrick being slow, as long as I'm going to shut down the server, I do want to actually just change to like a different web server. So I'm just going to do gem Puma, which is pretty fast, and I like that one. And then do bundle, restart my server, and then retry to log in and see what happens in the session and see what happens. All right, great. So that's installed. And now if I do, oops, not Rails S, Shotgun, it should choose Puma. Awesome, great. And now let's go back to my homepage. Beautiful, loaded. I am curious about what cookie got in here. So we do have a cookie in there. And this should be the rack session cookie that my Sinatra app did. This other cookie from localhost is basically from another Rails app I've been building, so I'm just going to delete that. But there's my cookie. And now if I go back to login and hopefully log in correctly, we should this time at least see the session output. Otherwise, we need to start debugging even more. All right, so once again, I'm just not, I just don't see anything being output over here from that. So I guess what I want to do at this point is actually jump to my users, to actually the welcome page. I'm going to put a binding.pry in here. That way I can inspect the session upon that redirect and see what the hell is going on. Okay? So let's go back to the login page. Let's log in correctly. Now it should redirect us, and I should end up into a pry console right there. And let's look at what's in session. Okay, so in our session, we have a session ID. There's definitely nothing about user ID in there. We have a tracking agent. We have our, a bunch of other stuff. But, whatever I thought this line of code was going to do, where I say session user ID equals @ user ID, nothing happened there. So, the first thing I want to do is basically, I sort of want to confirm this line of code and just make sure that I can find this user and authenticate them correctly, right? So there's that user, and just to mirror my controller code. So now @ user is equal to this thing, and if I call if I basically call @ user.authenticate and pass in test, let's see what happens. So that returns true or true-ish function and saying that I was able to authenticate that user, whereas if I did some other word, it would return in false. So this just isn't, we're not, for whatever reason, this just isn't setting data in my session, right? So, this is interesting because when I set it over here, I was able to see that there is now a session user ID of 2. So there seems to be some sort of disconnect between this controller and my application controller, as though these sessions aren't really being, I don't know, I guess maintained together or something like that. But there's some weird behavior. So let's go back to the Sinatra documentation for a second. All right, where we left last left off, I was having a hell of a time trying to get the sessions to work in our Sinatra application. After trying a ton of things, I discovered that what I was failing to do was setting a session secret. So without creating an encryption or salt for our session, our browser and our server weren't able to authenticate that the cookie in the session matched and was valid. So the second that I added set session secret along with enable sessions to my controller, logging in worked perfectly. So if I do newuser.com and log in as this person, you can see that there's a message now about who I'm logged in as. So TLDR, after 4 or 5 hours, if you want to enable sessions in Sinatra, don't forget to set a session secret so that the session gets encrypted and can be validated back and forth. So since getting the sessions working, and just to review how that works, is a user goes to this login page, which you can see on the right over here. The login form is basically kind of like the registration form. It's just a post request to /login. So after submitting the form from get/login, it would go to post/login. It then tries to find a user by the email they entered. So new@user.com, test, and then if a user is found and whatever password they typed in works with the authenticate method, which is provided by hasSecurePassword and basically takes care of, the encryption of their password against their plain text. If all that works, then we hide the user ID in the session and redirect to the home page. So that's kind of the login flow. Now on the home page, let's go over how this line, logged in as new@user.com, is happening, because I went a little ahead and I refactored some code, and I kind of want to just break down the pattern I used in the end. So let's go to the layout. And in my application layout, I have a line of code on line 23 that says if logged in ? So the idea here is that based on the return value of logged in, I'm either going to show them a logged in menu or the logged out menu prompting them to register or log in. So the first question is, what is this logged in ? method, and where is it defined? So originally I had something that looked like this, saying if a user ID is present in the session, that must mean they're logged in. But I didn't like the way that line of code looked because it didn't say what it was doing, it said how it was doing it. It was checking if they were logged in by the presence of a value in their session. And I would much prefer code that says what it's doing and not how it's doing it. So if logged in is really about what that line of code was, and if I want to know the definition for that, I can find the definition in app controllers, application controller. So what I'm using over here is a Sinatra method called helpers. And what helpers does is all of the methods that are defined inside of the block of helpers are accessible to the views and to the controllers of your application. So it's basically a way of creating some sort of shared backend functionality that you can use in your views and in your controller actions to sort of consolidate some common functionality, like, for instance, checking if someone is logged in. So how does the logged in method work? Well, it depends on this other method called current user. And how does current user work? It says to set @user or equals user.find session user ID if session user ID, which is to say, if there is a value in session user ID, try to find a user whose ID is equal to that session user ID. And then assign that user to the instance variable @user. So that's what would happen on the first call of current user. Because @user wasn't populated, this or equals would trigger the right side, which would ask, is there a session user ID? If so, find that user and assign it to the instance variable. So this method, current user, it's either going to return nil, which is to say, in the event that there is no user ID in the session, it will return nil, or it's going to return whatever user was found. So we have a truthy return value and a falsy return value. An instance of a user is truthy, nil is falsy. So what the bang bang is doing at current user is, if current user returns nil, which is to say that there was no session user ID, so this line of code never ran, so it's basically a method with no code in it, which would return nil. If I negate nil, I get back true. And then if I negate true, I get back what I actually want, which is false. The bang bang convention is a way of converting truthy and falsy values to honest to God true or false. And we see that nil is falsy. When we negate nil, we get true. And then when we negate that, which is the double bang, we get back false. In the event that we did find a current user, then it would be a user instance, which is considered true. And if we negate a user instance, we would get back false. And then if we negate false, we would get back true. So ultimately, what the logged in method is doing is using the return value of current user to return a true or false value. True if this method was able to populate this instance variable. False if for whatever reason it wasn't. So that's what logged in and current user are doing. And by declaring them helpers, I can use them in my views. So you can see on line 23, when I have the if statement logged in, it's based on this method definition. And then later on, assuming they're logged in, I can actually just say current user.email, because when I call current user, the value of @user will be returned to me, and I'll be able to say what the current user's email is. The next thing I built was a logout function. So when I click logout, it is going to go to this GET request, and session.clear will basically delete the person's session, which erases session user ID, which means that any other subsequent call to session user ID is going to return false. So simply by clearing out the session, I'm able to build a logout functionality. And with that, we have the login and the logout working. It was a long journey to get there, but the majority of it was making sure that session secret was set. The helper methods of logged in and current user allowed me to clean out my layout and make it more semantic. And that was basically the end of Sprint 1, which was the user functionality. I did go ahead and start Sprint 2, and I will take you through what I've already done, and we'll talk about what has to be done next. So Sprint 2 is all about playlists, about creating playlists, potentially adding songs to them. We're not sure yet, but that's what we want to deal with on Sprint 2, and I did some of the work, and I'll walk you through that now. Okay, to get the playlist functionality working, the first thing I thought about was the table. If a person is going to be able to create playlists in my application, I'm going to need to remember them, which means I need a new table. That table is going to have the name of the playlist the person is creating and the user ID of the person that created that playlist. So the first thing I did was generate a migration to create playlists, which created a table called playlists with the foreign key of the user ID and then a column for the name of the playlist. That was it. After I made the migration, I then stubbed out the model, the active record model, and declared a class playlist, which inherits from active record base, left it basically all alone, and then I basically went into Tux, which is our console, and made sure that I could create a playlist and attach it to a user correctly. So here we have playlist number 2 with user ID number 2, and if I say grab that playlist and I say user.email, that should give me the email address. Well, actually, we got an error. It says no method, undefined method user for playlist. Because while we have the foreign key, what we're missing is the association, which is fine. Because really what we were trying to test was mostly that the playlist model was hooked up. But we do know that at some point, we're going to create a belongs to over here and say that a playlist belongs to a user based on the user ID foreign key. In fact, once we do that, if I exit Tux and reload it, and I create a new playlist, so there's my new playlist. And now if I ask the playlist for its user, I get back user number 2. And if I say p.user.email, I would get back that user's email. So actually, we just did some work in that we wired up the association between a playlist and a user, saying that all playlists belong to users through the foreign key of user ID. Awesome. So after I made sure that the models work, the next thing I wanted to do was start working on these routes. We need to create an interface for a person to be able to make a playlist. So the first route I wanted to draw was this one, playlists new, which should present a person with a form that allows them to fill in the name of the playlist. So in order to get that working, I made a new file called playlists controller, and I defined a new class, playlist controller. I inherited from application controller, and then I wrote some code that we don't necessarily need to talk about right now. Because for this route of get playlist / new to work, the other thing I needed to remember to do is once I create a new controller, because we're in Sinatra, you have to remember to go to config.ru and mount that controller. Once that controller is mounted, you can go to playlist / new and see the form as it was intended to behave. Well, actually, that's pretty cool functionality. And I guess we should just talk about how that works. It's going to introduce basically the other 2 major things I did while I was building the really basic playlist functionality. So this controller, the ability to create a playlist, to look at a playlist, to edit one, to delete one, to publish one, all of that functionality needs to be behind bars. It needs to be guarded. The only people that should be allowed to create new playlists or edit them are people that are logged in. And eventually, we even need to deal with authorization and say that the only person that should be able to edit your playlist is you and not some other random logged in user. So the first thing I did was create an authentication pattern, which is simply saying that anyone who tries to go to these URLs needs to be authenticated. And the way I did that was with the Sinatra method before. And what before does is it takes in a URL pattern for which to apply the following rule. That is to say, what lines 2 to 4 are saying is, before anyone tries to visit, playlist /star. So anything with playlist slash, anything after playlist new, playlist edit, playlist one, playlist delete, playlist publish, whatever, any URL that's playlist /star, before we actually trigger that action, run a method called authentication required. And if we go back to application controller, there is our third helper method called authentication required. And what it's saying is, if the person is not logged in, set a flash notice, which we'll talk about in a second, and redirect them to the home page. And by redirecting them, we're basically preventing them from continuing their action to this page. So that every time I try to go to playlist /new, if I'm not logged in, I get redirected to the home page before the codes on line 6 to 8 can even run. Now, the special thing about this is how this message of "you must be logged in" got there. So let's go through the logic. When a person tries to access a GET request to playlist /new, before this action would render this ERB template, authentication required is called. So if we go to application controller and we look at authentication required, if they are not logged in, then we're redirecting to the home page. Then we see line 28, where we set something called a flash notice, "you must be logged in," where the goal is to communicate to the user why the application responded the way it did. If I comment that out and I try to go to playlist /new, the functionality still works and I'm redirected to the home page and I'm not logged in and I wasn't able to see that new playlist form, but there's also nothing communicating to the person why that happened. So what we might want to do is set like an instance variable called, let's say, error message. So I set this error message instance variable, and then I go to my layout and I spit out the value of @error_message. So the idea here is that when authentication required fires and they are not logged in, I will put some data in the instance variable @error_message, and then I'll redirect them. And my layout should be able to read from that instance variable. And let's see what happens. So as you can see, @error_message was basically blank. And let's talk about why, right? What's going on with instance variables, their scope and their lifespan in the context of a Sinatra request? So what's basically happening is that every time an HTTP request comes into our application is creating a new instance of a controller. So if we try to go to playlist new, behind the scenes, Sinatra is instantiating an instance of playlist controller. And that instance has, like any other Ruby object and instance of a class, instance variables. So on that instance of the playlist controller that was made when the person tried going to playlist /new, for a moment in time, that instance of the controller had an instance variable of an error message. However, then I redirect them. And when I redirect them to the home page, what Sinatra does is it forgets about that old instance of the playlist controller, and it makes a new instance of application controller so that it can respond to a GET request of the home page. And by redirecting and forcing Sinatra to create a new instance of a controller, all of the old instance variables from the last request are gone. So you get for every request, you're going to get a whole new set of instance variables. Instance variables can't pass from one request to another. So to get around that and to allow us to send data or send messages from one request to another, we have something called a flash, which uses sessions and cookies just like logging in. In order to get Flash working, you're going to have to go to your gem file and you're going to have to add a new gem called rack flash 3. Once that gem is added, you're then going to go to your environment and explicitly require the rack flash gem. Then you're going to go to your application controller and you're going to register the usage of rack flash. Once you do all those steps, which are really well covered in the rack flash 3 guide, which you can find on GitHub, once you do all that, you're going to get access to an object called Flash that behaves a lot like sessions. The way that Flash works is that it will remember this data for the subsequent request and no other. So that when I try to log in, or when I try to go to a page that requires authorization, the Flash notice gets set. And now I'm on a new request, which means I'm one request away from when this Flash notice got set. And if we look at the layout, we have a line of code on line 20 that basically says, make a div of class notice with the text of Flash notice if there's any data in Flash notice. And that's a way of basically passing error messages or data from one request to another in Sinatra and also in Rails. So that basically brings us up to date. We talked about how the login function works and the logout function by clearing the session. We talked about the purposes of these helpers, where logged in, that can be used in both a controller or a view, and current user can be used in both a controller and a view, and authentication required, which if used in a controller, will redirect the person back to the home page with a friendly message about why they got redirected. We declared all of those methods as helper methods. So then in our playlist controller, we could use a before filter and say anytime someone is trying to go to playlist/star, which would be a wildcard pattern that would match playlist new or playlist one or playlist destroy, we should call the method authentication required. When that method is called, if they're not logged in, they are redirected. So let's just log in. And now I'm going to go to the new playlists link. But in order to do that, I'm just going to make a new navigation item, a new playlist for now. And what happened now is when the application made a request to playlist/new, the before filter took over. It called authentication required. Because logged in returns true, because I was able to find a current user, because I had put in the user's ID in the session user ID when I logged in, this method, authentication required, returns true and doesn't redirect, which means Sinatra will allow me to continue to rendering the new playlists page. All right, so now that we are rendering the playlist/new view under some sort of authentication rule set, let's make this form actually work. So if I go to playlist new, I can see my H1, and I'm going to make a new form that's going to submit a post request to /playlist. And then I'm just going to grab some like boilerplate form code from here. And actually, all I really care about is the name of the playlist right now. So it's really just one field. And the playlist table actually has two fields, a user ID and a name. But we're not going to allow the person to enter the user ID that created this playlist from the front end. We're going to deal with that on the back end. So let me just grab a submit button. So this should be my form that allows the person to type in the name of their playlist. Great. And it's going to be a post request to /playlists. So let me just build that out really quick. So post to playlists do. We're going to say @playlist equals playlist.new. So we instantiate a new instance of the model. We make the name equal to params name, which is going to be whatever they typed into that field in the form. And then we say playlist.user equals current user. So what we're basically doing is setting the belongs to association on a playlist that we just created to be equal to the current user, which would be the person that submitted the form. Over here, we're using active record objects to make the association, but if you wanted, you could also go lower level and just set the foreign key manually. I believe that line 13 is a little more abstract and preferred, but essentially all we're doing is filling in values in the rows of the playlist table. Every time we create a playlist, we're filling in the name column for a new row, and we're filling in the user ID column for a new row. And that should always be whoever is logged in. So if that playlist was saved successfully, let's redirect right now to /playlists. Otherwise, we'll render the form again, and we'll deal with sort of processing validations at another time. So I'm just going to build one more route called /playlists. So the idea here is that after you've submitted a form to create a playlist, assuming the playlist was saved correctly, I want to redirect you to /playlists, which will be a new GET request to /playlists that will create an instance variable called @playlist. And the way it's going to populate that data is that it's going to try to find all the playlists where the user is equal to the current user, which is to say, the goal of this route or this action is to show someone all of their playlists. And in order to facilitate doing that, I'm just going to stub out a new view called index. And let's say your playlists. And then I'm going to say @playlists.each do. So that loop will iterate over all of the playlists that were loaded through the query of a select statement where the user ID is equal to the ID of the current user, and then render that view. So if I make a new playlist called house music, by filling out that form, I should have hit the post playlists route, and then so forth and so forth. So let's look at what's going on. So it says undefined method each for playlist, and this is happening on the index.html and at playlists. So what basically happened was find by returns one playlist, and I really intended for this code to return all of the playlists for the current user. I can fix that by doing a where statement instead of a find by, which will always return an array even if there's not a playlist for that user. And there you can see my house music playlist. But the nicer way to do that would be to reciprocate our belongs to user from our playlist model with our user model and say that a user has many playlists. Because once we tell a user that it has many playlists, in our index action, when we're looking for all the playlists for the current user, we can just say current user playlists. And there you go. So with that, we have the basic functionality of creating a playlist for authenticated users, along with the associations between the playlist and the user.